You need to pack your things and leave. I'll handle everything from here. My brother didn't even wait for the funeral to end before saying it. Funeral flowers still covered the mantel, their sickly sweet smell thick in the air. My father's suit draped over a chair in the corner, waiting to be put away by someone who would never wear it again. The living room was full of people who'd come to cry, their voices a low murmur of condolences and memories. My brother stood in the middle of it all, holding my folded coat like he was handing me garbage. He shoved it toward me with the same expression he'd used to dismiss a stranger who'd overstayed their welcome. I held my father's obituary in my hand, the paper still warm from the printer at the funeral home. The photo on the front showed Dad smiling, the way he used to smile at me when I showed him my report cards or helped him balance his ledgers. Now I was being erased from his house like I'd never belonged there at all. My suitcase sat in the hallway where I'd left it that morning, packed for a stay I'd thought would last weeks, while we sorted through Dad's things together. My brother's eyes were cold with a determination I didn't recognize, and something about the way he kept glancing toward Dad's study made my stomach turn. My name is Thalia Rios, and that shove split my grief into two pieces, the loss of a father and the dawning suspicion that someone else was trying to make his absence permanent. He slipped a key into his jacket pocket while talking to someone on the phone. I watched the small motion, almost casual, but it felt like theft when paired with his clipped, efficient tone. "Yes, I'll handle the paperwork tomorrow," he said into the phone, his back turned to the mourners in the kitchen. "No, she won't be involved in the estate management. I'm the executor." The word executor hit me like cold water. Since when? Dad had never mentioned making my brother the sole executor. We talked about the estate just months ago, sitting at this same dining table, and he'd been clear about wanting both of us involved. Now my brother was talking like I didn't exist. No one asked me where I planned to sleep that night. No one offered to help me find a hotel or suggested I stay in my childhood bedroom. They just assumed the household would be managed, that decisions would be made, that everything would be handled by the responsible son who'd always been better at business. I left with my duffel bag and a trail of paperbacks clutched to my chest, books Dad had given me over the years with notes in the margins. As I walked to my car, my father's last voice rang in my ears from a conversation we'd had years ago. "Keep your receipts, Thalia. Keep your head clear. Documentation matters more than people think." At the time, I'd thought he was just teaching me about taxes. Now I wondered if he'd been preparing me for something else entirely. When I returned to the house the next day, needing to collect more of my things, my brother stood in front of Dad's study with his back to the door. His shoulders were squared, his posture defensive. "We can't have you in there right now," he said without turning around. "Why not? The estate papers are sensitive. I need to organize everything before anyone else goes through it." His voice had that reasonable tone he used when he was lying, the same voice he'd used as a teenager explaining why he'd borrowed money from Dad's wallet. Not because of privacy, but because he wanted to control who saw what. I remembered being 16, sitting in that same study while Dad showed me how to balance ledgers. "Numbers tell stories, Thalia," he'd said, his finger tracing columns in his accounting book. "If you know how to read them, you can see the truth behind what people say." Dad had let me into that office dozens of times, teaching me about finances and estate planning. Now my brother guarded it like a vault, like something inside needed protecting from me specifically. "I just need to get some of Dad's personal items," I said. "Give me a list. I'll get them for you. I'd rather get them myself. Not today." The finality in his voice made it clear this wasn't a negotiation. I left, but not before noticing the new lock on the study door. Installed so recently, the wood around the screws was still fresh and pale. A neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, handed me a condolence card as I stood in the driveway. She squeezed my hand, her eyes soft with sympathy. "I'm sorry about all the paperwork," she said. "Your father always kept everything so tidy. He was meticulous about documentation." Her eyes flicked toward the house where my brother was visible through the window, moving boxes. "Must be hard sorting through it all." "What do you mean about paperwork?" I asked carefully. She fumbled, suddenly uncertain. "Oh, just that he was always organized. I remember him mentioning something about trusts and proper planning. He wanted everything clear for you kids." The way she emphasized "you kids" made me wonder what conversations she'd overheard, what Dad had said about his intentions for the estate. Later that afternoon, when my brother left for a meeting with the lawyer, I used my old house key to slip inside. The study door was locked, but I remembered Dad kept a spare key taped under the bottom drawer of the hallway desk. My hands shook as I found it, as I unlocked the door and stepped into the room that smelled like leather and old paper. File folders covered the desk, some labeled in Dad's careful handwriting, others in my brother's hasty scrawl. I didn't have time to read everything, but one folder caught my attention. It was thicker than the others, the edges worn like it had been handled repeatedly. Inside was a single sheet of paper that made my breath catch. I went to the probate clerk's office downtown, a fluorescent-lit space that smelled like copy toner and stress. The woman behind the counter had kind eyes and a patient expression that suggested she dealt with grief every day. "I need a copy of my father's will," I said, sliding the death certificate across the counter. She typed into her computer, her fingers moving quickly across the keyboard. Then she frowned, checked again, and looked up at me with confusion. "I'm sorry, there's no will on record for Antonio Rios." My stomach dropped so hard I thought I might fall over. I gripped the counter edge to steady myself. "That's impossible. My father was meticulous about planning. He talked about having a will." "I'm showing nothing filed in this county. Sometimes families file later, after they've had time to locate documents. Has the executor submitted anything?" "My brother claims he's the executor, but I haven't seen any paperwork." She gave me a sympathetic look. "Without a filed will, the estate goes through intestate succession. That means it's divided according to state law, usually equally among children. But Dad wouldn't have left things to chance. He'd spent evenings teaching me how to trace transactions and document gifts. He'd always said, 'Never assume anything is lost, Thalia. Paper trails exist for a reason.' If there was no will on record, someone had moved faster than grief allowed. Someone had made sure certain documents never made it to the courthouse. I called my brother that evening. The phone rang 4 times before going to voicemail. "Where is Dad's will?" I asked the recording, keeping my voice steady. "The probate office has nothing on file. We need to talk about this." He called back once, 30 minutes later. "There's nothing to talk about. Dad's affairs are complicated and I'm handling them. You don't need to worry about the details." "I'm not worried. I just want to understand what's happening with the estate. I'll explain everything once I have it organized. Right now, you're just making things harder by asking questions." Then he stopped answering my calls entirely. Texts went unanswered. Emails bounced back with an auto-reply saying he was dealing with family matters and would respond when possible. At night, I sat in my small apartment and scrolled through old emails, searching for correspondence I'd once seen between Dad and his attorney. There had been a thread I remembered, something about updated estate documents. But when I searched my archived folders, it was gone. Emails deleted like footprints in wet sand, erased so thoroughly I couldn't even find them in my trash folder. Someone with access to my accounts had cleaned them out. Someone who knew exactly what they were looking for and why it needed to disappear. I checked my email security settings and found a login from an unfamiliar IP address, accessing my account the day after Dad's funeral while I'd been at the house. The bank where Dad kept his safe deposit box was a sturdy brick building downtown that smelled like old money and polished marble. I walked up to the counter with my driver's license and Dad's death certificate. "I need to access my father's safe deposit box," I told the clerk. She pulled up the account and scrolled through the information. "I'm sorry, but someone has already accessed this box. Your brother signed the release 3 days ago. But I'm family too. I should have access." "Let me check the access list." She typed something, then shook her head. "Your father listed approved persons who could access the box in the event of his death. Your brother's name is here. Yours isn't included." The key in her hand clinked against the counter like a verdict. My father, who taught me about financial planning and documentation, had somehow excluded me from accessing his most important documents. Or someone had removed my name before I could find out what was inside. "Can you tell me what was in the box?" "I'm not authorized to disclose contents. I'm sorry." I left the bank with dust motes catching in my throat and the taste of betrayal on my tongue. The afternoon sun felt too bright, the street too loud. Everything Dad had taught me about being prepared, about protecting myself, seemed meaningless if he deliberately left me out. Unless he hadn't left me out at all. Unless someone else had made sure I couldn't access what he'd left for me. On the 3rd day after the funeral, I went to see Dad's old car in the garage. It was a sedan he'd driven for 15 years, maintained meticulously, the interior still smelling faintly of the peppermints he always kept in the console. My brother hadn't moved it yet, probably waiting for the estate to clear before deciding whether to sell or keep it. I sat in the driver's seat, running my hands over the steering wheel Dad had gripped thousands of times. The glove box fell open when I reached for the handle, spilling registration papers and old receipts onto the floor. And there, beneath the insurance documents, was an envelope with my name on it. My heart tripped over itself. I recognized Dad's handwriting immediately, the careful block letters he used when he wanted something to be clear. I opened the envelope with shaking hands. Inside was a single note. Thalia, check the old cedar trunk under the stairs. Trust Leslie if I can't be there. Leslie was Dad's attorney, someone I'd met only a handful of times, but who Dad had spoken about with respect and trust. The cedar trunk under the stairs had been in our house since I was a child, filled with old blankets and winter clothes. I'd looked through it dozens of times and never found anything unusual, but Dad's note suggested there was more to find. That night, I used my key to enter the house while my brother was out. The cedar trunk sat exactly where it always had, dusty and forgotten. I lifted the blankets and found nothing. But then I remembered something Dad had taught me about old trunks. They sometimes had false bottoms. I pried up the wooden base and found a packet of documents marked with Dad's initials. Inside the packet was a codicil, a formal amendment to a will. My hands trembled as I read the legal language. It was signed and witnessed, dated just 2 months before Dad died. And there, in careful legal text, was a line nomming me as co-executor of the estate alongside my brother. Someone had tried to erase my name. I could see where the ink had been smudged, where someone had attempted to rub out the letters before giving up. But the signature below was clearly Dad's, witnessed by 2 people whose names I recognized as employees at his attorney's office. If this document was authentic, it changed everything. My brother had been acting as sole executor, making unilateral decisions, locking me out of the estate process. But this codicil said I had equal authority, equal access, equal say in what happened to Dad's legacy. I photographed every page with my phone, making sure the images were clear and the signatures visible. Then I carefully replaced the documents in the trunk exactly as I'd found them, covering the false bottom with blankets and closing the lid. My brother couldn't know I'd found this. Not yet. Not until I understood what else he was hiding and why he'd worked so hard to keep me away from the truth. That night, I created multiple backup copies of the photos, storing them in cloud accounts and emailing them to myself at different addresses. If someone had erased emails before, they could do it again. This time, I wouldn't let evidence disappear. Xavier was an old friend from college who'd become a forensic accountant. We'd studied together, and he'd once tutored me in spreadsheet analysis when I was struggling with a statistics class. I called him from a coffee shop, speaking quietly. I need help understanding some financial documents. Can I bring them by your office? His office smelled like coffee and paper, the walls covered with certifications and degrees that proved he knew exactly what he was doing. I spread out copies of the documents I'd found. Including bank statements I'd managed to photograph from Dad's study during my brief access. Zavake studied them without speaking, his expression growing more serious with each page. There are transfers here that don't match any invoices, he said finally, tapping one column with his finger. Money moving through accounts that don't have clear purposes. See this? $50,000 moved from your father's business account to something called Estate Management Services. There's no corresponding invoice, no receipt, no documentation of what service was provided. He flipped to another page. Here's another one, $30,000 to Property Holdings LLC. I looked up that company. It was created 2 weeks after your father died, and the registered agent is your brother. I felt sick. What does that mean? It means someone's cleaning the books, moving money around to make it look legitimate when it's actually just being transferred to accounts they control. He looked at me with becoming quiet contempt. If you want to challenge this, we do it properly. No theatrics, paper first. We document everything, build an airtight case, and then we act. I confronted my brother at the house, the codicil photos on my phone but still in my pocket, not revealed yet. I wanted to see how he'd react to questions before I showed my hand. I need to talk to you about Dad's estate, I said. He was in the kitchen, going through Dad's mail with the efficiency of someone who'd already decided what mattered and what didn't. He looked up annoyed. What about it? There are transfers I don't understand. money moving into accounts I've never heard of. And I can't find Dad's will anywhere. He inhaled sharply, his jaw tightening. You're confused. Dad's things are complicated right now. There's a lot you don't understand about how estates work. Then explain it to me. I don't have time for this. I'm handling everything the way it needs to be handled. You need to trust that I know what I'm doing. He didn't deny seeing the documents I was asking about. He didn't claim ignorance. He just questioned my understanding, my competence, my right to ask in the first place. I left without showing him the codicil, but I'd planted a seed. He'd know I was digging now. He'd know I wasn't just the grieving sister who'd accept whatever he decided. And eventually, he'd have to respond to that knowledge. That night, he sent me a text. Stop causing problems. You're making this harder for everyone. I didn't respond. I just saved the text as more evidence of his attempts to control the narrative. I took the codicil photos to a notary I'd found through Zavuk's recommendation. She was a sharp-eyed woman named Patrasha who specialized in document authentication. She studied the images carefully, zooming in on the signatures. There's something interesting here, she said. See this signature. There's a slight inconsistency in the letter formation compared to other documents from the same time period. My heart sank. So it's forged. I didn't say that. I said there's an inconsistency. But look closer. She pointed to a barely visible tremor in one loop of Dad's signature. Your father had a minor hand tremor, didn't he? I nodded. Dad had developed it in his last year, nothing serious but noticeable in his handwriting. This tremor is consistent across all his late-period signatures. If someone forged this, they would have had to know about the tremor and replicate it perfectly. That's extremely difficult to fake. She pulled up comparison documents I'd brought, including bank statements Dad had signed shortly before his death. The tremor matches, the pressure points match. The letter formation, despite that one inconsistency, is characteristic of someone writing under stress or emotion. She looked at me seriously. In my professional opinion, this signature is authentic. The inconsistency you see is probably because he was upset or tired when he signed it, not because someone forged it. Relief flooded through me. The codicil was real. Dad had meant for me to be co-executor. My brother had hidden it deliberately, trying to erase my authority before I could claim it. Mrs. Alvarez from down the block stopped me at the grocery store. She was elderly but sharp, someone who'd lived on our street for 40 years and noticed everything. Thalia, dear, I'm so sorry about your father. He was such a good man. Thank you, Mrs. Alvarez. She hesitated, then lowered her voice. I saw him at the courthouse about a month before he passed. He was with a young man in a gray suit handling paperwork. When I asked what he was doing, he said he was taking care of something important. He looked relieved, like he'd just handled a difficult favor. Do you remember what day that was? Early September. I remember because it was right after Labor Day. I was renewing my driver's license. That timing matched the date on the codicil. Dad had gone to the courthouse to file the amendment, probably with his attorney's assistant. And he'd looked relieved because he'd ensured both his children would be protected, that the estate would be handled fairly. But somehow, that filed document had disappeared. Someone had made sure it never made it into the official record. Did you see my brother there? I asked carefully. Mrs. Alvarez's face clouded. Not that day, but I did see him at your father's house late one night, maybe 2 weeks before your father died. I was walking my dog past midnight, and I saw him leaving with a box. It seemed odd because he didn't usually visit that late. A box, late at night, 2 weeks before Dad died. I thanked Mrs. Alvarez and added her testimony to my growing file of evidence. Zavuk filed a request with the bank to freeze certain transfers pending verification of estate authority. It was a formal legal action that required responses from all parties involved. The bank had to notify my brother, had to ask for documentation proving he had sole authority to make these transfers. My brother called Zavuk's phone like a man trying to stop a leak in a sinking boat, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. This is ridiculous. I'm the executor. I have authority to manage the estate. Then you can provide the documentation proving that authority, Zavuk said calmly. The probate court shows no filed will nomming you as executor. The will is still being processed. Then until it's processed and approved, no transfers should be happening. The bank asked to meet with all beneficiaries to clarify the situation. Suddenly, everything convened in a conference room that smelled like stale coffee and fear. My brother sat across from me, his lawyer beside him, both of them radiating controlled hostility. The bank manager, a patient man named Hyuga, laid out the concern. Multiple large transfers with insufficient documentation, happening before the estate had been properly settled. "We need clarification on who has authority to make these decisions," Hugo said. I pulled out my phone and showed them the codicil photos. My brother's face went white. His lawyer leaned forward, studying the images. "Where did you get this?" "From Dad's house, where he left it for me to find." Victoria Cruz was the lawyer Mara had used for a guardianship case. She was small but fierce, with eyes that missed nothing and a reputation for winning cases people thought were impossible. I met her at her office, a small space above a bookstore that felt more like a library than a law firm. "I've seen estate disputes turn ugly," she said after reviewing my evidence. "Families get loud, and people do terrible things to protect money they think they deserve. If you go forward with this, you need to be prepared for your relationship with your brother to be damaged, possibly permanently." "It's already damaged," I said. "He threw me out of Dad's house before the funeral was even over." She nodded. "Then here's what we do. First, we authenticate the codicil through an independent expert. Second, we file a petition to open formal probate and demand an accounting of all estate transactions. Third, we request the court appoint a neutral administrator until everything is sorted out. What if he's already moved the money somewhere we can't trace? That's why we move fast. We file emergency motions to freeze accounts. We subpoena bank records. We make it so expensive and risky for him to continue hiding things that cooperation becomes his only option." She leaned back in her chair. "You said your father taught you about documentation. Now we use that. Evidence first. Emotion second. We build a case so solid that when we present it, there's no room for argument." I took a breath and made my choice. Methodical rather than loud. Evidence first. Witnesses next. Justice through process, not through anger. The landscaper who'd maintained Dad's property for 15 years called me out of the blue. His name was Paulo, and he sounded nervous on the phone. "I heard you were asking questions about your father's estate. There's something you should know." We met at a diner, and he brought a manila folder full of receipts and invoices. "Your father always paid me in cash," Paulo explained. "He said it was easier for his bookkeeping. But after he died, your brother paid me with a check from an account I'd never seen before. When I asked about it, he told me to keep it quiet." "Why would he do that?" "Because the amount on the check didn't match what your father owed me. It was double. Your brother said it was a bonus for years of service, but it felt wrong. Like he was trying to make the books look different than they actually were." Paulo slid the folder across the table. "These are all my receipts from the past 5 years. Every payment your father made to me, documented with dates and amounts. If your brother's claiming different numbers, you'll be able to prove it." The pieces clicked like puzzle corners falling into place. My brother wasn't just hiding Dad's will. He was manipulating the financial records, making the estate look different than it actually was. Inflating some expenses, hiding others, moving money through channels that couldn't be easily traced. All to make it look like there was less to inherit, or that he'd legitimately spent estate funds when he'd actually pocketed them. Paulo's receipts gave me concrete evidence of the manipulation. Working late one night in my apartment, I reviewed documents I'd managed to copy from Dad's study during my brief access. One book caught my attention, a leather-bound ledger Dad had kept in his own personal shorthand, a system of abbreviations and codes he'd developed for his business. I'd learned to read it years ago when he was teaching me accounting. Most entries were straightforward: income, expenses, client payments. But there were sections marked with asterisks that looked different. Entries about shadow expenses and balance adjustments, money moved to help the company look healthy during difficult periods. Dad had been cautious about presentation, about making sure his business appeared stable even when times were tight. He'd called these entries emergency reserves, money held in separate accounts that could be moved back into the business when needed. On the last page, in Dad's handwriting, was a single line: "Failure to know if needed. Documents in cedar trunk. Trust Leslie." Knowledge, finally, that felt like permission. Dad had prepared for this possibility, that someone might try to manipulate his estate after his death. He'd left me instructions, hidden in code he knew I could read, pointing me toward evidence he knew I'd need. I photographed every page of the ledger, making sure to capture the codes and the final instruction. This wasn't just evidence of financial manipulation. It was proof that Dad had specifically wanted me to find and use this information. An uncle I barely spoke to, my father's younger brother Tomas, showed up at my apartment unannounced. We'd never been close, our interactions limited to obligatory appearances at family gatherings. He stood in my doorway holding a cardboard box. "Can I come in?" Inside, he sat on my couch and wouldn't meet my eyes. "We all thought your brother was taking the lead because he was closest to your father, because he'd been handling business matters for years. It seemed natural. But the way he's handled money since your father died, he's always had a taste for control, for making decisions without asking others. Your father knew that. He used to worry about it." Tomas opened the box and pulled out a stack of receipts and old letters. "Your father gave me these years ago. He said if anything ever happened to him, and if your brother tried to push you out, I should make sure you had them. I didn't understand what he meant then. I'm sorry I waited this long." The receipts showed business transactions Dad had kept separate from the main company books. Insurance policies, property deeds, investment accounts. All documentation that would be crucial for understanding the full scope of the estate. "You deserve the truth," Tomas said quietly. "Your father trusted you. He wanted you protected. I should have given you these sooner." After he left, I added the new documents to my growing pile of evidence. Each piece strengthened the case, made it harder for my brother to claim ignorance or justify his actions. Victoria filed a petition to open formal probate and request an examination of all estate accounts. My brother hired an aggressive lawyer, someone with a reputation for winning through intimidation and theatrical courtroom performances. At the first hearing, his lawyer tried to frame me as the unstable sibling looking for attention, someone whose grief had made her paranoid and vindictive. "Miss Rios has shown a pattern of emotional instability," the lawyer said, his voice dripping with false concern. "She's made wild accusations without evidence, harassed family members, and attempted to interfere with the orderly administration of a complex estate." I sat in the courtroom and listened as my life was summarized into a sentence designed to minimize me. As they tried to paint my questions as mental instability, my grief as manipulation, Victoria stood and responded with cold precision. "Your Honor, Miss Rios has documented evidence of irregular financial transfers, a hidden codicil nomming her as co-executor, and multiple witnesses who can testify to the authenticity of these documents. This isn't grief talking. This is a daughter protecting her father's wishes." She handed the judge copies of the codicil, Xavier's financial analysis, Paulo's receipts, and statements from multiple witnesses. The judge studied them carefully, his expression unreadable. Finally, he spoke. "I'm ordering a full accounting of the estate and freezing all accounts until we can verify proper authority. We'll reconvene in 30 days. The judge did not look impressed with theatrics. He looked interested in facts, in evidence, in truth. And for the first time since Dad's funeral, I felt like someone in authority was actually listening. Victoria hired a private investigator named Marcus who specialized in financial crimes. He was thorough and quiet, the kind of person who disappeared into backgrounds and noticed patterns others missed. Within 2 weeks, he uncovered phone records linking my brother to a man named Vincent Herrera, someone who arranged shell transactions for clients wanting to hide money movements. The records showed dozens of calls between them, starting 3 months before Dad died and intensifying in the weeks after the funeral. Marcus also found emails my brother had thought were deleted, recovered from cloud backups the deletion software hadn't reached. They showed discussions about managing the estate transition and ensuring sole control of disbursements. One email was particularly damning. "The sister won't be a problem. She doesn't understand the business side." The records were a map of evasions, showing exactly how my brother had planned to manipulate the estate and cut me out of the process. When Marcus presented his findings in court, my brother's face went pale. His lawyer tried to dismiss the evidence as circumstantial, as normal business communications taken out of context. But the pattern was too clear, the timeline too precise, the intent too obvious. "These communications show premeditation," Victoria told the judge. "This wasn't confusion about estate procedures. This was deliberate manipulation starting before the decedent even passed away." My brother stammered about business necessities, about needing to protect Dad's legacy, about making hard decisions. But his explanations fell apart under questioning. He'd sunken into the kind of lies that feel solid until light hits them. Hugo, the bank manager who'd first flagged the suspicious transfers, requested a private meeting with me. We sat in a conference room at the bank, the table between us covered with printouts and highlighted statements. Once you supplied the codicil and the court ordered an accounting, we were able to do a comprehensive review, Hugo said. What we found is concerning. He slid a printout across the table. It showed transfers from Dad's charitable fund, an account he'd used to support local nonprofits and community projects. Over a period of 6 months after Dad's death, money had been systematically moved from the charity account into accounts that later funneled funds into luxury purchases. Your brother bought a car, Hugo pointed to one transaction. $80,000 traced back through 3 different accounts to the charitable fund. Here's another, a down payment on a vacation property. $50,000, same source. Why would he do that? My voice was barely a whisper. To hide lifestyle expenses, Hugo answered. If he'd taken money directly from the estate, it would have been obvious. But by routing it through charity accounts and shell companies, he made it look like legitimate business expenses or approved disbursements. He showed me more transactions, restaurants, designer purchases, travel expenses. All luxuries my brother had enjoyed while telling me the estate was too complicated for me to understand, while claiming we needed to be careful with Dad's money. The total amount diverted is approximately $300,000, Hugo said. That's criminal fraud, misuse of charitable funds, tax evasion. The implication landed like a blow. My brother hadn't just hidden Dad's will or tried to push me out. He'd been stealing systematically, using Dad's death as an opportunity to fund a lifestyle he couldn't otherwise afford. The family called a meeting to resolve matters quietly. It happened at Aunt Rosa's house, a neutral location where cousins and uncles gathered with confused expressions and uncomfortable silences. My brother expected allies. He'd spent weeks calling relatives, explaining that I was causing unnecessary problems, that everything was being handled properly. But when we walked into Rosa's living room, the atmosphere wasn't what he'd anticipated. Rosa started by asking direct questions about checks she'd never received, memorial fund donations Dad had supposedly made in her name, but that she'd never seen documentation for. A cousin piped up about invoices that didn't match services actually provided. Uncle Tomas asked about property deeds that seemed to have been transferred without proper authority. The room that had once applauded my brother's confidence now buzzed with doubt. People who'd assumed he was managing things correctly were starting to see the gaps in his explanations, the inconsistencies in his stories. I've been handling a complex estate, my brother said, his voice tight. There are details you don't understand. Then explain them, Rosa said firmly. Because right now it looks like you've been moving money around without proper authorization, and Thalia's the only one asking the questions we should have all been asking. My brother tried to redirect, to claim that family shouldn't air problems publicly, that we should trust each other. But the trust was gone. Too many questions, too much missing documentation, too many transfers no one could explain. The family meeting that was supposed to silence me instead amplified my concerns, spreading doubt through the entire extended family. The court issued a temporary freezing order on all suspicious accounts and appointed an interim trustee to oversee the estate while the investigation continued. The trustee was a neutral accountant named Ms. Franklin, someone with no connection to either side and a reputation for thorough, impartial work. Overnight, my brother's options shrank. He couldn't move money, couldn't sell property, couldn't make any significant decisions without Ms. Franklin's approval and documentation. I watched him pace the courthouse hallway after the hearing, making angry phone calls that went nowhere. His lawyer counseled patience, suggested cooperation, warned that fighting the court order would only make things worse. But my brother had spent so long controlling everything that losing control felt like losing everything. For the first time since Dad's funeral, I watched him lose the calm mask he wore like armor. His confidence cracked, revealing the fear underneath. Still, I never gloated. Never made dramatic speeches or confrontational phone calls. I just sat in the courtroom quietly, letting the law do the unglamorous work of undoing what he'd done. Victoria had been right. Facts were more powerful than emotion. Documentation was more convincing than anger. And patience, the kind of methodical patience Dad had taught me when we balanced ledgers together, was proving to be the most powerful tool of all. The court proceedings moved slowly. each hearing revealing more evidence, each document supporting the case that my brother had manipulated the estate for personal gain. Ms. Franklin's investigation uncovered that several assets my brother had claimed for himself were actually held in trust for community projects Dad had funded. Dad had been passionate about supporting local education and small business development, setting aside specific funds for scholarships and microloans. My brother had tried to fold these restricted accounts into the general estate, claiming they were personal assets available for distribution. But the trust documents showed clear restrictions. The money couldn't be used for anything except the designated purposes, and Dad had appointed specific trustees to oversee these projects. When those trustees examined the records Ms. Franklin provided, they were furious. Money had been diverted. Accounts had been raided for personal expenses. The charitable work Dad had cared deeply about had been treated like a personal piggy bank. They sided immediately with the evidence we'd compiled, providing additional documentation that strengthened the case against my brother. His claims to various properties and accounts were dismissed in multiple filings. The court ruled that he'd acted without proper authority, that the codicil was authentic, and that I had equal standing as co-executor. My brother tried to appeal, but procedural missteps his first lawyer had made left him with weak legal ground. The aggressive theatrical approach that was supposed to intimidate me into backing down had instead created a documented trail of overreach and misconduct. The man who tried to lock me out of my childhood home found himself locked out of the estate's finances, his access restricted to documented, approved transactions only. The house smelled of old lemon oil when I finally walked through the front door with executor papers in my hand. 6 months had passed since that terrible day when my brother had shoved my coat at me and told me to leave. Now I held legal authority to be here, to make decisions, to honor what Dad had actually wanted. I turned the key in Dad's old study, the lock clicking open with a sound that felt like resolution. I sat at the desk where he'd sat for decades, running my fingers over the worn leather desktop, breathing in the dust and the quiet. The afternoon light filtered through the windows exactly as it had when I was 16, and he was teaching me to balance books. I didn't dance on anyone's ruin, didn't gloat or celebrate my brother's diminished position. Instead, I cataloged. I called the trustees of Dad's charitable projects and assured them the funds would be restored and properly managed. I reached out to community organizations Dad had supported and explained that his work would continue. I ensured that family members received fair accounting of the estate, that everyone understood what Dad had actually left behind, and how it would be distributed according to his wishes and state law. I also signed an order to sell one property my brother had particularly wanted for himself, a small commercial building Dad had invested in years ago. The proceeds went toward the scholarship fund Dad had talked about creating, something he'd mentioned during our late-night conversations, but had never formalized before his death. When my brother's eyes met mine across the study one afternoon, when he came to collect some of his personal items under Ms. Franklin's supervision, he looked diminished. Not ruined, but seen. The confident mask was gone, replaced by someone who finally understood that actions had consequences. That manipulation left traces. That family meant something more than control and convenience. "I never wanted to take everything from you," I said quietly. "I just wanted the truth to matter." He didn't respond, just gathered his things and left, his shoulders hunched in a way I'd never seen before. I closed the ledger Dad had kept, the one with his careful notations and his final message to me. Then I walked outside into a clean late afternoon, the sun warm on my face, and began building the future Dad had whispered about on those nights when we balanced books together. Not a future based on inheritance or property or money. A future based on honesty, on documentation, on making sure that people's wishes were honored and their legacies protected. I opened a small consulting practice, helping families navigate estate planning, teaching them the lessons Dad had taught me about keeping clear records and protecting themselves from manipulation. I worked with the trustees of Dad's charitable projects, ensuring his community work continued and expanded. And I kept the house, not as a monument or a prize, but as a place where I could remember who he was and who he'd helped me become. Someone who knew that the truth, when documented carefully and presented with patience, was more powerful than any lie. Someone who understood that real strength wasn't about control or intimidation. It was about clarity, about standing firm in what was right even when standing alone. My brother had tried to erase me from Dad's legacy. Instead, he'd forced me to claim it in ways I never would have otherwise. To step into authority I'd been afraid to assume. To use skills Dad had taught me that I'd never fully appreciated. The key turned in my hand as I locked the study that evening, the weight of it familiar and right. Dad's legacy wasn't the house or the money or the property. It was the knowledge he'd passed on, the values he'd insisted mattered, the documentation he'd taught me to keep. And that legacy no one could take away, not with manipulation or lies or locked doors. Because I'd learned what he'd been trying to teach me all along. That truth, properly documented and patiently pursued, always finds its way into the light.